Hi, I'm Governor Kathy Hochul, and I'm so proud to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. Confronting domestic and gender-based violence is and always has been extremely personal to me. My mother was an advocate for survivors of domestic violence for decades, and I worked with her to open a shelter in Western New York. She understood that to support survivors, we need to listen to them and be responsive to their needs, meeting them where they are. We need to build supportive communities for survivors and help them feel safe, heal, and find justice. Throughout my career, I've done everything in my power to follow her example. And for 30 years, this agency has been on the front lines of this critical work. When it was created, the goal was to assess how we as a state were meeting the needs of survivors. As those needs increased and grew, so did the scope of OPDV's work. And in time, we also learned that the system that was created to protect and support survivors was no longer doing enough. That's why I directed this office to put the needs and voices of survivors at the forefront of their work. We'll be introducing Kelly Owens, our Director of Prevention of Domestic Violence, in a couple of moments. So I want to thank her for all her leadership. We've worked together on this. It's been a long journey since my Lieutenant Governor days. New York State has transformed the system to be more survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive. We've made significant investments in domestic violence and sexual assault prevention programs, as well as to support survivors of domestic violence.
The household has become, for many, a house of horrors. The horror is wife-beating.
Well, I think the first was just to have some credibility that this was a thing that happened to them. I mean, when I began, it's hard even for me to sort of believe this now. People didn't even understand. When you said domestic violence, people kind of looked at you, you know, and I could actually remember at a point in time when that phrase became commonplace and, you know, it was no longer a surprise to hear it. But at the beginning, it was like, there wasn't even an understanding of what we were talking about.
Until very recently, the problem of battered wives got very little attention from police.
Things were very different in terms of the climate around domestic violence in this country, and certainly in New York State. If I heard the word domestic violence on the TV and I was in the other room, I would come racing in to see what it was about because nobody ever talked about it.
It's a silent crime that happens behind closed doors. It happens in all walks of life, regardless of age, race, or background. It affects 1 out of 3 women, maybe you or someone you know.
Have you thought about the impact of gender-based violence? Have you thought about the impact of sexual assault? Have you thought about the impact of domestic violence on the policies and programs that you're working with? That's our job. Our job is to create social change, which is really unique for a state agency.
17,000 people lost their lives as a result of family violence. Why? What causes family violence?
I think the misconception, number one, across the board, is that people believe that domestic violence is a physical thing. Okay, I've had clients come through here who say they're never physically abused, but when we go through all the other ones, and they'll say, oh my goodness, I fit every single one of those.
Domestic violence is one of those issues where hundreds of years of condoning, supporting, both socially, politically, and with the laws, of saying that it's okay.
You know, everything was disjointed. It was really a group of committed survivors sort of working in their own little domain or silo, trying to serve as many survivors as they could. But to say we had a system 30 plus years ago, we as a state, much like many other states across the country, did not.
It was really the advocates in the community that were working on this issue for many years. But in terms of recognition on a state level, that was something that was very new.
It's hard to believe that it's been 30 years since New York established the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. I'm proud of the growth the agency has had throughout New York State in providing services to those experiencing domestic and gender-based violence. This office has always been important to me because I see the need for it in my own community. This state office has long needed to respond to and address domestic violence, sexual assault, gender-based violence, campus safety, and teen dating abuse, and New Yorkers have been safer for its existence.
And it was really during my chair as a judiciary chair that I started to work very closely with the domestic violence victims community.
New York State was one of the first states to really recognize partner abuse as a problem, as an issue that needed to be addressed across the board. First as a task force to look at the issue and study the issue, and then as a council that was charged with implementing the recommendations from the task force, and that eventually evolved into an agency because there were clearly roles for government to play, and in order to do that, an agency needed to be formed.
You know, OPDV has been around for 30 years, and we were an innovator, and we continue to be an innovator in the area of domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence. I'm really proud to sit in the seat at OPDV on the shoulders of women who led this agency for 30 years.
We were a national innovator in the 1980s and 90s in creating basically the basic infrastructure needed to support DV survivors leaving abusive relationships. I guess most notably that we New York moved away from volunteers helping women to having a funded professional system with rules, regulations to ensure consistent and high quality services throughout New York State.
But at the time, you know, again, we were dealing in a world where there just was not a willingness to enforce the laws against domestic violence as there were other kinds of laws.
There's no doubt the law thinks twice before it reaches behind closed doors and calls a wife beater to account. In America, a man's home is still very much his castle.
Law enforcement had to take it seriously. The courts had to take it seriously. It wasn't just a problem that affected families. But what we know now is that people need more of a holistic response.
I think in the last 30 years, we've really come to question our reliance on the criminal justice system as the best and only response to partner violence.
Under this governor, OPDV has been given the directive to dig deeper, to look at this work with different lenses, to understand that race, sexual orientation, and gender really play a role in how we need to deliver services and how we have to think about this work differently and more in depth.
Obviously, housing is an issue that affects New Yorkers, but it has a particular impact on victims of domestic violence because we really, in this state and I think really in the country, there's a system that has developed of requiring the domestic violence victim to leave their home situation rather than requiring the abuser to leave the home situation.
We need to be able to think outside of the box in addition to all of the great solutions that we've developed and thought about. We also need to look at, non-criminal justice kinds of interventions for survivors and their families. So it doesn't mean we eliminate the ones that we have. We just need to create a greater array of options for survivors.
Everybody who's experienced partner violence needs a response that is responsive to them as a unique individual. And so sort of using this broad brush approach is not going to be effective.
All they know is that they're in trouble. They have DV situations. They're either being, abused physically, emotionally, psychologically, financially, which is a big one. So they just know that there's a problem and they need to resolve this problem. So us as advocates coming through and sitting with them and speaking with them, again, we have to tread very lightly in terms of the language, obviously, and the religion and the culture beliefs.
They need to be believed and they need not to be blamed. And they need to have options. And we need to have a community and a society that doesn't re-victimize and make it harder for them to be able to find safety and security.
The survivor voice really has to be at the center of how we think about how we're going to move forward. We have to understand their lived experiences and really understand why and why they don't come for services in the current system that we've built. In order to do that, you got to talk to them. You got to listen to them. You got to understand their experience within the system. They are the most important voice in changing this work.
What survivors need is for people to understand their challenge holistically. They almost always need money, and they need us to appreciate that intimate partner violence is not a moment in time, it's a journey.
What are you dealing with when you actually have a victim of domestic or sexual assault in front of you? It isn't just the incident, it's the whole experience that they've been through as a survivor that now we have to look at.
We need to be able to have programs that help survivors, not because of what we think that they need, but actually hear their voices and be able to direct dollars for what they have determined are their needs.
So our work here at OPDV over the past 3 years has really been focused on what's the public policy and how does it impact programs, and how do we get stakeholders to work together to build a better system, one that is trauma-informed, culturally responsive, and survivor-centered.
What I loved about being in government was the idea of effectuating policy that could help so many people at one time. But I did also learn that to be responsible in government, you have to do that being informed by voices from the ground.
You know, I think one of the most important things that we need to realize is we need to be grateful for those survivors who come forward and are willing to talk to us and tell their stories. They're brave people. I want to thank the providers who work with them every day. It's not an easy job. It's one that really requires you to dig deep into somebody's life and actually live it with them. And these aren't easy things. So we have to acknowledge that our provider network and our survivors are really the key to how we move forward.
Just because now, we do have a system of shelters, we do have some laws, does not mean that the problem has been solved. It doesn't mean that we can sort of all, put our stuff away and go home, that there remains a problem.
We talk about what we can do as a state government. We can talk about it, we can declare Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We do it every year. I'll continue to do that. But we also have to build supportive communities for survivors.
To build more awareness, to build stronger understanding, to look at ways around accountability, to think about ways that we can prevent domestic violence from occurring in the first place.
And again, it comes back to educating, because knowledge is power.
The strength of people here in New York, that the future, I think, is really bright, and I'm excited about that.
I'm hopeful for this agency, I'm hopeful for this state, and I'm hopeful for people. And I know that we're up to the challenge to make this a better system.
Things would be very different today if not for OPDV.
New York made a commitment 30 years ago to work towards ending violence in our interpersonal relationships. It's our job as leaders in New York to ensure that we are constantly updating and improving our services as we continue to address this critical issue. The Assembly will always consider how to create greater safety for survivors of gender-based, domestic, and sexual violence in our legislative work for New York State. We'll continue our collective mission with the New York State's Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence.
There's no place for domestic and gender-based violence in the state of New York. I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues in the legislature and Governor Hochul to support the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence and help survivors and their families get the protections, resources, and services they need and deserve.
And I'm proud to say we're the only state in the country with a cabinet-level agency devoted to gender-based violence. Now is the time for us to recommit ourselves to doing everything in our power to support and protect survivors and to shine a light on this far too prevalent issue. New York State has led the way in this critical work for 30 years, and I have no doubt will continue to lead for the next 30. Thank you.